Riding season is upon us. It's time to start looking for your next bike. Today I'm going to give you some tips on finding the deals and avoiding the duds coming up. So you've found the bike, you know what you're looking for, you've contacted a few people, you're ready to go look. First, before you head over to go check out that bike, you need to take two things with you. I consider these to be very important. What are they? Simple: flashlight and a paper towel. The reason for the flashlight and the paper towel is so you can get in, check fluids, colors, and see into the engine and around the fairings, places that you normally couldn't. On a Super Sport, that's needed, not so much on a naked, but it still helps. One piece of advice that I can give you is when you first pull up to look at a bike, make sure the mileage is as advertised. Now, higher mileage does not necessarily mean that the bike is not worth buying. If the price is a little high, you can use that for a negotiating point, but it all comes down to the maintenance. So you want to see if the person has changed the oil on a regular basis, if they've kept up with everything. Ask them what kind of oil they use, how often they change it, when's the last time they've changed the air filter. Those are going to be things that you can't readily get to without removing the tank. You're going to have to take their word for it unless they have the receipts. So after you've checked the mileage, visually look over the bike, make sure there's no damage. If it's a fairing bike, feel the plastics. Pull on them, make sure everything's good and tight. Stand in front of the bike, make sure everything looks fairly well centered up. Make sure when you turn the front wheel that everything lines up in a perfect line on the bike. Step back a few feet and get a good visual. Make sure it looks like everything's been well taken care of. A good tip to follow is if you go to look at a motorcycle and the engine is hot, ask the person if they had just got back from riding. If a person tells you, yeah, you know, just in case you decided to buy the bike, I wanted to get one last ride in, that's kind of understandable. Good reason for the bike to be warm. If the person is a little shady about the answer, like, well, you know, I just pulled it out and cranked it to let it warm up, it's really important to try to listen to the bike run from a completely cold start. A lot of bikes that aren't properly fuel mapped, that have aftermarket parts and accessories, or never had the oil filter changed, maybe that they have higher mileage and they're overdue for valve adjustment. Checking the valve clearance is not that hard to do on your own, but if you have to take it somewhere, that's several $100s more you're going to have to pay. And being able to listen to the bike on a cold start, if it's hesitant to start up, could be a weak battery. If it ticks more than it normally should, if a bike hasn't been ridden in a while, you may get a little tick on a cold start. That's kind of normal, and a oil change with a high quality oil and a bit of riding will usually make that go away. But if the bike ticks from a cold start until it gets almost completely warm, you have issues that need to be addressed. So try to get the bike and look at it from a completely cold state. Slightly warm's okay. They may have had to crank it to pull it around to their driveway from a basement or a garage or something like that, as long as it's not absolutely hot. If you can touch the engine, the crankcase, you're good. Just take your flashlight, look around, make sure nothing looks damaged. There's no chewed up wires from mice, no garbage, anything like that. You're just wanting to see that the bike's in fairly clean, maintained order right now. Check the rotors. You want to feel these. Make sure they don't have any sharp edges or seams. If you feel a ridge at the edge, especially on the rear, that typically means that they were a rear brake rider. So you may have to replace the rotor. If you have to do that, that's a fairly expensive part. Check the brake pads, make sure there's plenty of meat on them. Before you start the bike, you want to check the fluids. Open the cap up, give it a good inspection. Wipe it with your rag. Make sure no crud or residue comes off. Make sure it looks like oil and not oil and coolant. It doesn't look like milk. Take your finger or take a Q-tip with you, just don't drop it down there. Get a little bit of fluid on your finger and then wipe it straight off. That oil has been changed recently. There's not a lot of carbon buildup in it. Everything looks good. This is what you want to look for. We're looking for general overall maintenance. Now, a recent oil change can fool you on that, but at least they did change the oil. Check the ridges on the sprocket. Make sure they have the proper rounded points on the ends and they're not perfectly peaked. If your sprocket looks like this right here, that means you're going to have to replace that as well. Another couple $100. If the sprocket looks like that, typically the chain's going to need replacement as well. Grab the chain, check it for tension. You see we have some oil, some grease, but yet there's no grit in that grease. That's important. That means this chain has been cleaned and lubed properly. Another thing to have the rag for, so you can wipe your hands off. Good chain tension, the sprocket looks good. This bike's been taken care of, or it has new parts on it. If it's new parts, that means you'll get more ride time out of it before you have to change it. If the chain looks rusty, if there's kinks in it, if it looks like this, then again, that's something you're going to have to replace. That is not safe to ride on. Another thing you'll want to do before you turn the ignition on, let's pop the seat and have a look underneath. Open the seat up. You want to look for cleanliness. Everything's clean on this bike. Typical dust, I mean, you're going to get that from riding. Look at the battery, check the date if it's stamped, make sure that it's fairly new. If it's not, that's again something you might have to incur cost on to replace. Pop the reservoir, check the brake fluid, make sure that it doesn't look burnt or overly dark. It's still got a nice light color to it and it's at the proper levels. Fuses, you can look to see if the spares are still in here. That's optional, not something that you really have to do. Again, we're just looking for cleanliness. You can see this bike has a fuel tuning module, a MZS system. Ask them what kind of map they've put in the bike, if they have any copies of it, if they have the software, the cables, all that good stuff. Because if you have any issues with the bike, the first thing you can do is go in and revert any changes or look for updates, or maybe you want to go get a tune yourself. So check that out, ask questions about that as well. Okay, so once you've looked over the fairings, got a little bit of history on the bike, what the service has been, last time the plugs, the air filter, things of that nature have been changed, the ones you can't get to. Found out what kind of oil type that the previous owners used. Ask them if they have any spare quarts that would go with the bike. Ask them if there's any maintenance accessories that they're going to let go with the bike. Maybe they have a set of wheel stands that maybe they're not buying another bike. They'll let you have those. Leftover fluids for the bike. Any factory parts that they've taken off. This bike has a set of aftermarket rear sets. It also has aftermarket exhaust. Maybe they still have those laying around. Hey, I want those if I buy this bike. You know, ask them if they still have those parts laying around. You can always sell those and recoup some of the cost of the bike if they do. OEM parts are a pretty big seller on eBay for people rebuilding bikes. All right, it's time to start the bike up. Flip the key. Listen for that fuel pump to prime up and stop. Let it sit there for just a moment. Again, we're going to look at our mileage. Oil lights on. That's normal because the bike's not running. Neutral. On ABS model bikes, the ABS light will be on until you actually travel forward on the bike a few feet. So it's time to fire it up. Make sure your kill switch is in the run position. There's no ticking. The idle is good. We're between 1 and 2,000 on this digital gauge. The warm-up idle on this bike is around 1500 RPMs. Standard idle is around 1200, 12 to 13. That looks to be good. It's idling fast because we did a cold start. So we're going to let that warm up and then listen to see how it idles after it's warm. And while the bike's warming up, you can take this time to walk around and make sure that all of the headlights, turn signals, things of that nature work. Oh, there's a headlight out. What's up with that? If you're not familiar, bikes with two headlights, typically one of them is the high beam. So when you flip that on, the second headlight will come on. So if you see that, not an issue. So the bike has come down to its normal idle. We're sitting 12 to 1300 RPMs. Recovered exactly where it needed to be. No lapse, no lug, no hesitation going back to idle. That's what you want to hear. If you hear prolonged ticking of the engine, again, the bike's probably due for valve adjustments. This bike has 14,700 miles on it. It's only halfway to needing that done. So we've looked at the fairings, we've checked our fluids, we've checked our sprockets, we've checked our chain, we've checked our brakes, we've checked our rotors. You also need to check the tread on the tires. You're going to go through about 2 rears. Sometimes you can stretch and get 3 out of every 1 front. So you want to look at the rear tire. Check that rear tire. It's going to be very important. You want to look for any dry rotting. That'll look like cracked leather kind of down the sidewalls typically. You can also see it on the edges here. This is a good tire. It's fairly new. Really, really good tread depth on these. I can't even touch the bottom inside the center treads. It's a practically brand new tire. There's no dry rotting. It's seen highway use. So front and rear, check that. Make sure everything's good. Well, you just looked over the bike. We made sure that all the basic stuff and the sprockets, the tires, the fluids, everything looks good, and it's time to sit on it and see how it feels. Keep in mind this is someone else's property. If you're not familiar with the model, the make, the weight, the feel of the bike, be careful when you get on. Check your center of gravity, your balance. You can see that this is a tall bike. We're on a slight incline, so I have my right leg down to support the weight. If it's going to tip, it's going to go downhill. Feel the bike. Check the front forks. We're going to just hold the front brake in. Give it a couple good rocks. Make sure there's no fluid leaking out of the seals. Everything's nice and firm. The forks look straight. The grips feel good. These are brand new, so they're going to be. Make sure these aren't cracked or wore out. Make sure they're not loose and they don't spin. If a grip is loose, that could cause you to miss clutch, lose control of the bike, have an accident. Check the front brake reservoir. There's a little glass on the front here. Make sure it's got the proper amount of fluid for that. Have a look at the screen. Make sure it's clear. You can see through it. It's good and tight. Bike feels good. It's got a good seating position. These are aftermarket bars. Again, ask them, do you still have the bars that came on the bike? You may want to take those. Take every part that you can get from the bike that they still have that's OEM. If you don't like the way something feels, like these rear sets are high. You may want the more lower, comfortable riding position. You can throw them back on, sell these. You can sell the OEM if you decide you don't want to put them back on. There's always benefits to buying a bike from an individual. As long as it's been maintained, you can recoup that money. But there you go. If you're happy with the bike, if you know what you're looking at, check all the expensive parts. If anything looks expensive to fix to you, If it doesn't look quite right, don't take the person's word for it. Have someone with you that knows the bikes, can give you some advice, or say, hey, let me think about it. Contact someone, ask them about it, take some pictures of the bike, maybe have it taken to a shop or a mechanic, let them look at it for a final diagnosis. And if you're still happy with it, make an offer. If you're not, just walk away from it. There's plenty of bikes for sale. I hope I've helped some of you guys to look over a bike and be able to know what to check to see if the bike's been maintained and if you're getting a good deal. If you have any questions, leave them below in the comments. If you have anything to add, leave those as well. Guys, happy shopping for your motorcycles. When you find one, please ride safe, wear your gear, and until next time, we'll see you later.